Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays, midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
Did you ever feel that things were not quite right? That everything was just ever so slightly askew?
Do you have, to paraphrase Morpheus, a splinter in your mind?
If you're interested in hearing the latest information about UFOs, the paranormal,
ancient cultures and structures,
monatomic elements,
longevity,
fantastic discoveries in science,
downloaded to your brain,
then tune into us. Hi, I'm Dave.
And I'm Mackie.
And we are Shiny Side Out, Sundays 2 to 4 a.m. Eastern. See you then.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here. All right. Thanks for listening while we took that short break here at Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. And yeah, we're going to get back to your host. All right. Good afternoon. You're listening to Free Association, which is changing slightly. I'm going to do another Shadow Play show today. I was listening to some material on YouTube from Wener Erhart, who was the guy who founded EST a long time ago and is involved in the Landmark Education Trust or whatever, both of which are slightly dodgy organizations. And I'm not suggesting anybody go and check them out particularly. But what he had to say when I was listening last night, I found quite a lot of videos on YouTube. And I've got one lined up. I'll play about half an hour. But I want to talk about the shadow and what it might be. Because I need to come to some kind of understanding of what the shadow is before I can really develop methodologies for working with it. So the Carl Jung definition, very roughly speaking, is anything you can't really handle consciously goes into the shadow. So as an example, I'm quite socially shy. I'm withdrawn socially quite often. So my shadow would be dominating a social situation. It would be the energy to have everybody's attention on me, which, all right, I've got a little bit of attention on me on the radio, but it's not exactly the same thing. It's one version of that. So that, to an extent, is me tapping into and integrating my shadow, is actually getting on the radio and talking for an hour. Because that's not something I do when I'm in a group normally. I'll chip in and I'll do 10 minutes here and there in a conversation, but I don't tend to dominate, whereas other people do tend to dominate in conversations, and their shadow will be withdrawing, stepping back and listening. So the shadow of speaking is listening, and the shadow of listening is speaking. So it's kind of the opposite. It's the opposite set of qualities. That's one way of looking at it, and it's as good a way to start as any. So I'm gonna use that as a working definition. So whatever's conscious, the shadow is the opposite. So that's fine. So that's the definition I'm kind of using as a working definition. And as I say, Werner Erhart, the clip that I'm going to play is using a lot of language that comes from Martin Heidegger. There's some phrases that come from Jean-Paul Sartre. So it's existentialism is mainly what he's talking around. The idea that he's describing is that life has no meaning except the meaning that we give it. So in and of itself, whatever you're doing and whatever you're thinking and whatever societies you belong to don't have any intrinsic meaning. They're just a physical building, or they're a place to go on a Tuesday night, or whatever it is. The meaning comes from us. We project onto it our own meaning onto the organization or onto the event, and that makes sense to me to some extent. I mean, I tend to go with neutral or positive interpretations mostly. Sometimes I dip into the negative, but that's life. Sometimes the situation could be one that your immediate reaction is to get annoyed or withdraw or whatever because it's an uncomfortable situation. But the meaning actually comes from me. It's not in the situation itself. So that meaning might be coming from something in my past and being projected out, or it could be coming from here and now and being projected out, but the meaning is always a projection. Now, there's not necessarily anything wrong with projection in that kind of situation, but it can be frustrating, or it can be part of the shadow that you're projecting out. So if there's something you've not dealt with from way back, and you meet a similar situation, quite likely you're going to project onto that situation from the previous thing that was in your childhood or in your adolescence or whatever it is. So the interesting thing is to notice the difference, is to take that meaning out and just look at the actual physical situation and see how much of it's emotional stuff that's being projected out. So that's my approach to the shadow. It's all about the projections. It's all about that type of thing. I've got a tune from Rory Gallagher queued up that is just a bit of fun, really. I'll play a couple of minutes of this, and then I'll put the Werner Erhart on. There you go. So just a little bit of Rory Gallagher to get us started. And let's see. I'll bring up the Werner Erhart quickly here. I've got it queued up, so it shouldn't take long.
The audio tape you are about to hear was produced by Werner Erhart and Associates, an education.
To avoid loss, we're willing to sacrifice love in order to justify. The being of human beings is a mechanism, the end of which, the purpose or design function of which is survival. See, now you can't hear it because you know it's going to work out. You're just sure it's going to work out. It isn't going to work out. Really, it is not going to work out. This is all there is. This, what you got, is what there is. Never mind the fairy tales. This is it. It is not going to work out because it has already worked out. This said, the knight in shining armor is not going to ride into your living room and carry you off. So you better stop saving it. You better give it up now. More importantly, to come to grips with our own fundamental inauthenticity begins to alter the mood of being in which we live. From one of resignation to one of a kind of authenticity or honesty about the inauthenticity which we are. One begins to wake up in an environment of being that has a certain quality of authenticity which no one covering up this ever knows about. I didn't say that was true. I said that I met a guy in a diner and that I meant what I said. And I'm asking you to stand in the possibility of what I said and look out at your everyday way of being. I'm not asking you to surrender or to give in to the being of human beings, the being which is using you. No, I'm asking you to confront it, to accept it, not like give in or surrender, but to accept as in be with. All that noise in your life, all that chatter in the back of your head, all that evaluation and judgment and assessment, the whole story in which you are a player in the script called your life, I'm asking you to consider the fundamental inauthenticity of that. That is really very much like a thunderstorm, to which you and I have added this great fantasy, this great story, this great soap opera. Maybe it doesn't mean anything when you're sad. Maybe you're just sad. Maybe it doesn't mean anything more than it means when it rains hard outside. Oh, I know, you think it's out to get you. Really, you do. You even complain about it. Like kicking in your windshield when you have a flat. Maybe it really doesn't mean anything. And maybe that isn't sad either, because maybe that doesn't mean anything either. See, maybe it doesn't mean anything that it doesn't mean anything. I know you're fighting against it, because you think it means something that it doesn't mean anything. You showed up as a human being, that's the total options. That's the being of human beings, like what you inherited. That's our inheritance. And we're all waiting for it to turn out, and it is not going to turn out. This really is it. There are no hidden meanings. There are no secrets being kept from you. It isn't going to turn out. It isn't going to get better. It gets better and it gets worse, and it gets better and it gets worse as we thrash around amongst the options. But remember, the box in which the options come determines the quality of living, not which option you choose. I know you think your option's right. You chose the right option. You got it figured out. You got it made. Okay, I accept it. You did. The only problem is that it's all in that box. And in that box, there is no being. None. There's right, wrong, dominate, avoid domination, win, lose, justify, and invalidate. So don't fool yourselves about having a choice. Yes, I grant that you've got options, but no choice. By the way, when I say this is it, I don't mean that nonsensical stuff about be here now. Or let it all hang out. When I say that life doesn't have meaning, that you are devoid of meaning, devoid of purpose, you're a thunderstorm with a lot of conversation about meaning and purpose in which you are very engaged. Some people want to use that as a justification for something. If you use that as a justification for something, you don't get it. That it's meaningless and empty is not a justification for not doing anything. That it's meaningless and empty is meaningless and empty. You can't use it. And if you do use it, if you make a therefore or a prescription or a justification out of it, you didn't get it. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. It's empty to the end. Remember, I didn't say it was true. And I know you think that it's an alternative thing to believe. I say it's a possibility in which to stand and look out at life. Now, we've only got 3.5 hours. We can't get into these things to the depth to which I would get into them if we had the time. There's a much bigger possibility here. This is designed to give you a taste of the real thing that's different than being told about it. You know, when you taste the banana split, it's different than being told about a banana split. But a taste of a banana split is also different than eating the whole banana split. So this is a taste of the forum, of the work of the forum. Taste. We want to take a look from a slightly different perspective. Let's see. We talked about is earlier. We said that when you live is, those ises use you. A black cat is unlucky. That uses you. We said that it is thought that a black cat is unlucky will use you less. Black cats being unlucky is a superstition. That will use you very little. That will leave you with the freedom to be. So in this investigation of the being of human beings, I want to talk about not what shows up like the circumstances of your life. See, people always think, well, if you don't know me, that is to say, if you don't know my circumstances, if you don't know my story, if you don't know what's happening in my life, how can you say anything that's of any value to me? You don't know me. I know you're very attached to your own story, like it's who you are. But I'm really more interested in the box in which your story shows up. I'm really more interested in the context in which your circumstances live. So I want to investigate with you, take a look at with you, the boxes you inherited when you showed up as a human being. The domains of showing up, rather than what shows up. The domains of showing up for the circumstances and the story of your life. The domain of showing up for the feelings and thoughts and so on and so forth of your life. When you show up as a human being, what kind of showing up opportunities are there? Well, let's use an example of the person with whom you live. You go home and you say, I love you. What we should say when we go home is I live the concept I love you. And I measure my feelings against my concept of love. And if my feelings match my concepts of love, then I feel good about my love for you. And if my feelings at the moment don't match my concepts of love, then I begin to doubt my love for you. I live the concept I love you, and I examine my actions. And when my actions match my concepts of love, I feel good about what I've done. And when my actions don't match my concepts of love, I feel guilty about what I've done. I live the concept I love you. And I know that I'm living the concept I love you because I can remember, most of us, I can remember living in the presence of my love for you. And the presence of love is distinct from love as a concept, and by contrasting the two, I can see that it would really be right to say I live in the concept I love you, and every once in a while, but not often, I'm in the presence of my love for you. I know that's real enough for you to follow. And it's all right with me if you think that what I just said is not true about you, but everybody else. So that demonstrates, because we don't have the time to go into it any more deeply, that there are domains of showing up that are distinct from one another, in which X can show up in one domain, and the same X can show up in a different domain. We can have love as a presence and love as a concept. It's the same stuff, it's love. But please notice how different the impact is on the quality of our living between love as a presence and love as a concept. Now, I picked the subject, namely love, which is easy to talk about, because again, we have very little time. But I'm saying that the kind of being that a human being is, when you showed up as a human being, you had available to you two domains of distinction, two ontological domains, two domains of showing up, in which life could show up as an experience, and life could show up as a representation of experience. I say the kind of being that human beings are loses their inheritance, so that they lose the distinction between these two domains of showing up, and life neither shows up discretely as an experience, as a presence, nor does it show up as a concept, as a representation. But
All right, that's enough of Werner Erhart for the time being. He does kind of dominate the room, I think it's fair to say. And for people who've just shown up, just arrived, Mitzi, Werner Erhart is a guy who founded EST. I don't know whether you know anything about EST. I don't know a lot about it, but I know there's a reputation goes with it as a little bit of a cult. But I watched an interview that he did at a film festival fairly recently, and he seems like he's got interesting things to say, so I thought I'd just play a little bit of it. I'm not recommending anybody goes to Landmark Forum or anything like that. I'm just interested in what he has to say. And a lot of the language he was talking about, a clearing that makes room for possibilities, which essentially is Martin Heidegger. So I was interested in the fact that he was using a lot of existentialist language in his seminars, and he seems to push a lot of buttons for a lot of people, which will give people an opportunity to clean up some of their shadow, which is essentially what I'm focusing on. So let's see if I can find something else. Not Werner Erhart this time. Not. We'll go for another conversation with Carl Jung, I think.
Appropriate to begin my exposition by defining the concept with which it deals. But I would rather approach the subject the other.
Okay, so this is on synchronicity. It's on the Think Neo Think channel on YouTube.
Other way, and first give you a brief description of the facts which the concept of synchronicity is intended to cover. As its etymology shows, this term has something to do with time, or, to be more accurate, with a kind of simultaneity. Instead of simultaneity, we could also use the concept of a meaningful coincidence of two or more events, where something other than the probability of chance is involved. A statistical, that is, a probable concurrence of events, such as the duplication of cases found in hospitals, falls within the category of chance. Groupings of this kind can consist of any number of terms and still remain within the framework of the probable and rationally possible. Thus, for instance, someone chances to notice the number on his streetcar ticket. On arriving home, he receives a telephone call during which the same number is mentioned. In the evening, he buys a theater ticket that again has the same number. The three events form a chance grouping that, although not likely to occur often, nevertheless lies within the framework of probability owing to the frequency of each of its terms. I would like to recount from my own experience the following chance grouping, made up of no fewer than 6 terms. On April 1st, 1949, I made a note in the morning of an inscription containing a figure that was half man and half fish. There was fish for lunch. Somebody mentioned the custom of making April fish of someone. In the afternoon, a former patient of mine, whom I had not seen for months, showed me some impressive pictures of fish. In the evening, I was shown a piece of embroidery with sea monsters and fishes in it. The next morning, I saw a former patient who was visiting me for the first time in 10 years. She had dreamed of a large fish the night before. A few months later, when I was using this series for a larger work and had just finished writing it down, I walked over to a spot by the lake in front of the house, where I had already been several times that morning. This time a fish a foot long lay on the seawall. Since no one else was present, I have no idea how the fish could have got there. When coincidences pile up in this way, one cannot help being impressed by them. For the greater the number of terms in such a series, or the more unusual its character, the more improbable it becomes. For reasons that I have mentioned elsewhere and will not discuss now, I assume that this was a chance grouping. It must be admitted, though, that it is more improbable than a mere duplication. In the above-mentioned case of the streetcar ticket, I said that the observer chanced to notice the number and retain it in his memory, which ordinarily he never would have done. This formed the basis for the series of chance events, but I do not know what caused him to notice the number. It seems to me that in judging such a series, a factor of uncertainty enters in at this point and requires attention. I have observed something similar in other cases, without, however, being able to draw any reliable conclusions. But it is sometimes difficult to avoid the impression that there is a sort of foreknowledge of the coming series of events. This feeling becomes irresistible when, as so frequently happens, one thinks one is about to meet an old friend in the street, only to find to one's disappointment that it is a stranger. On turning the next corner, one then runs into him in person. Cases of this kind occur in every conceivable form and by no means infrequently. But after the first momentary astonishment, they are, as a rule, quickly forgotten. Now, the more the foreseen details of an event pile up, the more definite is the impression of an existing foreknowledge, and the more improbable does chance become. I remember the story of a student friend whose father had promised him a trip to Spain if he passed his final examination satisfactorily. My friend thereupon dreamed that he was walking through a Spanish city. The street led to a square where there was a Gothic cathedral. He then turned right around a corner into another street. There he was met by an elegant carriage drawn by 2 cream-colored horses. Then he woke up. He told us about the dream as we were sitting around a table drinking beer. Shortly afterward, having successfully passed his examinations, he went to Spain, and there, In one of the streets, he recognized the city of his dream. He found the square and the cathedral, which exactly corresponded to the dream image. He wanted to go straight to the cathedral, but then remembered that in the dream he had turned right, at the corner, into another street. He was curious to find out whether his dream would be corroborated further. Hardly had he turned the corner when he saw in reality the carriage with the two cream-colored horses. The sentiment clue déjà vu is based, as I have found in a number of cases, on a foreknowledge in dreams, but we saw that this foreknowledge can also occur in the waking state. In such cases, mere chance becomes highly improbable because the coincidence is known in advance. It thus loses its chance character not only psychologically and subjectively, but objectively too, since the accumulation of details that coincide immeasurably increases the improbability of chance as a determining factor. For correct precognitions of death, Derriex and Flammarion have computed probabilities ranging from 1 in 4 million to 1 in 8 million. So in these cases it would be incongruous to speak of chance happenings. It is rather a question of meaningful coincidences. Usually they are explained by precognition, in other words, foreknowledge. People also talk of clairvoyance, telepathy, etc., without, however, being able to explain what these faculties consist of or what means of transmission they use in order to render events distant in space and time accessible to our perception. All these ideas are mere names. They are not scientific concepts which could be taken as statements of principle, for no one has yet succeeded in constructing a causal bridge between the elements making up a meaningful coincidence. Great credit is due to J.B. Rhine for having established a reliable basis for work in the vast field of these phenomena by his experiments in extrasensory perception, or ESP. He used a pack of 25 cards divided into 5 groups of 5, each with its special sign: star, square, circle, cross, 2 wavy lines. The experiment was carried out as follows. In each series of experiments, the pack is laid out 800 times in such a way that the subject cannot see the cards. He is then asked to guess the cards as they are turned up. The probability of a correct answer is 1 in 5. The result, computed from very high figures, showed an average of 6.5 hits. The probability of a chance deviation of 1.5 amounts to only 1 in 250,000. Some individuals scored more than twice the probable number of hits. On one occasion, all 25 cards were guessed correctly, which gives a probability of 1 in 298 quadrillion, 23 trillion, 223 billion, 876 million, 953,125. The spatial distance between experimenter and the subject was increased from a few yards to about 4,000 miles, with no effect on the result. A second type of experiment consisted in asking the subject to guess a series of cards that was still to be laid out in the near or more distant future. The time factor was increased from a few minutes to 2 weeks. The result of these experiments showed a probability of 1 in 400,000. In a third type of experiment, the subject had to try to influence the fall of mechanically thrown dice by wishing for a certain number. The results of this so-called psychokinetic PK experiment were the more positive, the more dice were used at a time. The result of the spatial experiment proves with tolerable certainty that the psyche can, to some extent, eliminate the space factor. The time experiment proves that the time factor, at any rate, in the dimension of the future, can become psychically relative. The experiment with dice proves that moving bodies, too, can be influenced psychically, a result that could have been predicted from the psychic relativity of space and time. The energy postulate shows itself to be inapplicable to the Rhine experiments, and thus rules out all ideas about the transmission of force. Equally, the law of causality does not hold, a fact that I pointed out 30 years ago, for we cannot conceive how a future event could bring about an event in the present. Since for the time being there is no possibility whatever of a causal explanation, we must assume provisionally that improbable accidents of an acausal nature, that is, meaningful coincidences, have entered the picture. In considering these remarkable results, we must take into account a fact discovered by Rhine, namely that in each series of experiments the first attempts yielded a better result than the later ones. The falling off in the number of hits scored was connected with the mood of the subject. An initial mood of faith and optimism makes for good results. Skepticism and resistance have the opposite effect. That is, they create an unfavorable disposition. As the energetic, and hence also the causal, approach to these experiments has shown itself to be inapplicable, it follows that the effective factor has the significance simply of a condition which makes it possible for the phenomenon to occur, though it need not. According to Ryan's results, we may nevertheless expect 6.5 hits instead of only 5, but it cannot be predicted in advance when the hit will come. Could we do so, we would be dealing with a law, and this would contradict the entire nature of the phenomenon. It has, as said, the improbable character of a lucky hit or accident that occurs with a more than merely probable frequency, and is, as a rule, dependent on a certain state of affectivity. This observation has been thoroughly confirmed, and it suggests that the psychic factor which modifies or even eliminates the principles underlying the physicist's picture of the world is connected with the affective state of the subject. Although the phenomenology of the ESP and PK experiments could be considerably enriched by further experiments of the kind described above, deeper investigation of its basis will have to concern itself with the nature of the affectivity involved. I have therefore directed my attention to certain observations and experiences which, I can fairly say, have forced themselves upon me during the course of my long medical practice. They have to do with spontaneous, meaningful coincidences of so high a degree of improbability as to appear flatly unbelievable. I shall therefore describe to you only one case of this kind, simply to give an example characteristic of a whole category of phenomena. It makes no difference whether you refuse to believe this particular case, or whether you dispose of it with an ad hoc explanation. I could tell you a great many such stories, which are in principle no more surprising or incredible than the irrefutable results arrived at by Ryan, and you would soon see that almost every case calls for its own explanation. But the causal explanation, the only possible one from the standpoint of natural science, breaks down owing to the psychic relativization of space and time, which together form the indispensable premises for the cause and effect relationship. My example concerns a young woman patient who, in spite of efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose, namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day, with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had had an impressive dream the night before, in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned round and saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabid beetle, or common rose chafer, whose gold-grain color most nearly resembles that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patient with the words, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. This story is meant only as a paradigm of the innumerable cases of meaningful coincidence that have been observed not only by me, but by many others, and recorded in large collections. They include everything that goes by the name of clairvoyance, telepathy, etc., from Swedenborg's well-attested vision of the Great Fire in Stockholm, to the recent report by Air Marshal Sir Victor Goddard about the dream of an unknown officer, which predicted the subsequent accident to Goddard's plane. All
right, so that's on Synchronicity. It's on the Think Neo Think channel, written by Carl Jung. And there's some interesting things about synchronicity. I've had quite a lot of synchronicity in my life along the way, or what I've interpreted as meaningful synchronicity, which could be just walking to a particular part of the town I live in that I don't normally go to, and bumping into an ex-flatmate, or it could be what else is there? There was some telepathy in the bath a few months ago that I talked about on this show as well. So I'm familiar with all of these types of things. The one concern I have about synchronicity is Given if we assume Erhart's conclusion that everything on its own has no meaning and we project the meaning onto it, and synchronicity and paranoia are quite similar processes. They're the process of projecting meaning onto something that isn't necessarily there. So there's two different interpretations of the same process going on. You can see things based from fear, or you can see things based in wonder. Synchronicity is wonder, and obviously paranoia comes from fear. But it's the same process of projecting meaning onto an event or a meeting or whatever it is. All right, so that deals with synchronicity a little bit. I think if we're looking at the shadow, you've got to look at both sides. If it's a process that we're talking about, then both sides of the process. So the shadow of synchronicity would be paranoia. Let's see if we can find something else that's of a similar type. So we've got some Jordon Peterson talking about existentialism from 2017. Play a little bit of that as well, because that links in with the Wener Erhart clip.
Body, that's one way of thinking about it, and your mind. And so that there are fewer paradoxes in the way that you manifest yourself in the world. So the concentration on action is one of the fundamental characteristics of existentialism. Another one is the insistence upon trouble and suffering as an intrinsic element of human experience. So you could say we could concentrate on subjective experience. What's your life like to you? How do you experience it? And we could say, well, built into that is trouble. Built into that is chaos. Built into that is anxiety and pain and disease. And then you can fall prey to those things without there being something wrong with you. Now, if you pin down a psychoanalyst like Jung or Freud, they would, of course, admit that human misery is endemic to human experience. But Freud, in particular, tended to look for adult psychopathology in childhood misadventure and pathological childhood experience. And he at least implicitly claimed that if you hadn't experienced childhood trauma and you had developed properly, that what would happen is that you would end up healthy, roughly speaking, certainly mentally sound. But the existentialists, they don't really buy that perspective right from the beginning. They basically make a different claim, which is that life is so full of intrinsic misery, let's say, but suffering is a better way of thinking about it, suffering that manifests itself as a consequence of your intrinsic vulnerability, that psychopathology is built into the human experience. There's no real way of avoiding it, or at least there's no reason to look for extra causes. That might be a better way of thinking about it. And you'd be surprised how often that sort of observation is useful for clinical clients, for example, because one of the things that's quite characteristic about people, especially if they're introverted and they don't have very many friends, they don't have people to talk to, if they're suffering, maybe they're depressed or anxious, or they have some sets of strange symptoms like agoraphobia or obsessive compulsive disorder, one of the things they always presume is that the fact that they're suffering in that manner means that there's not only something wrong with them, but something uniquely wrong with them, so that it's their fault and no one else is like them. And one of the things you do as a diagnostician, you'll hear a lot of rattling about how labeling is bad for people, and certainly mislabeling is bad for people. And even an accurate label can be a box that you can't get out of, but it's very, very frequently the case that if you diagnose someone, it's a relief to them like you can't believe, because they come in to see you knowing that something isn't going properly. But they think, well, they're the only person facing it, and that means they're idiosyncratically strange in some incomprehensible way that no one else could possibly understand, and there's no way they could ever get better. And one of the things you do is point out to them is like, yeah, depression and anxiety doesn't really require any explanation, right? There's plenty of reason. I don't remember who said it. Everyone has sufficient justification for suicide. I think that was the claim. Well, but the point is that if you look through the experiences of the typical person, unless they're very, very fortunate, and they won't be that way forever, that's certainly the case, that they can point to traumatic experiences in their life, death and loss and illness and humiliation and all those sorts of things that are sufficient to account for existence in a state of quasi-permanent negative emotion. Now, often if you see, as I said, if you see people who are depressed and anxious by nature, they assume that everyone else is the smiling face that you see on Facebook, and so that alienates them from other people and themselves even more than certainly far more than necessary. And part of the psychoeducation that goes along with therapy is merely educating people to understand that a fair bit of misery is the norm, and that there's plenty of genuine reason for it. And so the existentialists basically start from that stance. It's like a fall of man stance in some sense, because deeply rooted in the Western tradition, roughly speaking, is the idea that people are divorced from some early paradisal state, and that it was of something like self-consciousness that produced that demolition of humanity and left us in a damaged state. And people think they don't believe that, but they believe it all the time. And it's frequently how people experience themselves, as if there's something wrong that needs to be rectified. And it seems unique in some sense to human beings. It doesn't seem all that obvious that animals think that way, but people definitely think that way. And so all the existentialists basically take that as a given. And then they offer another question, which is, well, given that that's your lot and that there's ample reason for misery, how is it that you should conduct yourself? Because merely, say, giving into that misery or multiplying it doesn't seem to be to do anything but multiply it. It doesn't seem to do anything but increase it. Now, so it's bad to begin with. You might say, well, increasing it is definitely going to be, increasing it is something that you have to regard as worse. So how do you conduct yourself in the face of misery? Okay, so how do they present that to begin with? Well, this is from Pascal, and this is an existential statement that describes the position of the individual in the universe, you might say, or you could say that it explains a deep characteristic of individual experience or existence, hence existentialism. When I consider the brief span of my life, swallowed up in the eternity before and behind it, the small space that I fill or even see, engulfed in the infinite immensity of spaces which I know not, and which know not me, I am afraid, and wonder to see myself here rather than there. For there's no reason why I should be here rather than there, or now rather than then. And so that's an element of existential thinking that is shared with the phenomenologists called thrownness. And that's a term that Heidegger originated, if I remember correctly. And what it means is it's an analysis of a certain characteristic of human experience, which is that, well, there was an immense span of time in which you could have been born, but you weren't born then, you were born 20 years ago. And there was an immense span of time in the future that you could have been born, and you weren't born then either. You were born when you were born, and you're who you are, and you have exactly the characteristics that you have. And there's something tremendously arbitrary about that. It's as if you were thrown into experience, and that's what thrownness means. It means that you were randomly placed in a place and time, and there's something fundamentally irrational about that, meaning that there's no real way of understanding it. It's something you have to deal with. And you might say, well, why was I born poor, or why was I born less attractive than I might be, or why was I born less intelligent than I might be? Or maybe why was I born to these terrible parents at this particular horrible moment in time? And in some sense, there's no answer to questions like that. It's just how it is, and you have to deal with it. So the question is, for the existentialists, how do you deal with that? This is Walter Kaufman, if I remember, no, Rolomé. Rarely has the existential question been put more simply or beautifully. In this passage, we see first the profound realization of the contingency of human life, which the existentialists call thrownness. Second, we see Pascal facing unflinchingly the question of being there, or more accurately, being where. Third, we see the realization that you cannot take refuge in some superficial explanation of time and space, which Pascal, scientist that he was, could well know. And lastly, the deep shaking anxiety arising from this stark awareness of existence in such a universe. There's a fairly well-developed line of social psychological theorizing known as terror management theory. And the basic premise of terror management theory is that human beings have belief systems, and what the belief systems do is serve to protect them against death anxiety. And that's derived from the work of Ernest Becker, by the way, who wrote a great book called The Denial of Death. And his theories in The Denial of Death have been put to the test by the terror management theorists with, I would say, some success. But I think the theory is flawed because I don't believe that Becker phrased the issue properly. I think it's deeper than a fear of death, and that's what the existentialists are attempting to communicate. It's more like terror it's more like terror of isolated being. You know, it's not only that you're mortal, you know, that you have a border, a temporal border, you're born and you die, but also that during that time you're vulnerable to all sorts of things and all sorts of contingencies, one of which of course is death, but it's by no means the only one that is horrifying. I think you can certainly make a case, like the existentialists do, that the mere fact that you're limited in the face of infinite complexity is also a primary existential problem. It's a problem that human beings have been dealing with ever since they started to understand. They started to make sense of concepts that were beyond their immediate experience. Now, millions of years ago, or tens of millions of years ago, when our ancestors lived in trees, you could be sure that they were frightened of what surrounded them. They were frightened of, when they were little, they were frightened of birds that might pick them out of a tree, and they were afraid of cats that might climb a tree and eat them. They were afraid of snakes that would come slithering along and bite them. And they existed in a space that was safe, surrounded by a space that wasn't safe, that was full of predatory entities. And those were primarily birds of prey and cats and snakes or other reptiles. And then what seemed to have happened as we evolved was that the way we construed the world, you can think of the world as a safe place surrounded by the possibility of predation, but you can also think of the world as the known surrounded by the unknown. It's the same idea, except put up one level of abstraction. And the unknown has the same relationship to us in some sense that the territory of predators has relationship to us. And we use the same circuitry to represent the absolute unknown that we used so many millions of years ago to represent predators. Now, it's more complicated for human beings because, first of all...
All right, so that's Jordon Peterson. It's on Jordon B. Peterson's channel on YouTube from a lecture series he did on personality in 2017, and the title of the video is Existentialism, Nietzsche, Dostoevsky, and Kierkegaard. So it's all existentialist ideas about the formation of personality and the meaning of life, really. Jordon Peterson likes existentialism. I quite like existentialism, but it's not the only thing that I look at. The Carl Jung piece that I played and existentialism kind of contradict each other. because existentialists would say that there's no intrinsic meaning, and Carl Jung would say that there is meaning. So there's a contradiction there straight away. So you're listening to Revolution Radio. It's a listener-supported station. There's two channels playing, Studio A and Studio B, more or less 24 hours a day, and we are listener-supported. So if you can get to revolution.radio and you've got $5 in your pocket or $10 in your pocket, then it's probably a good idea to support things that you like. There's things on here that you won't like. There's things that you will like. Either way, support it because it's free speech. And if you're not prepared to be challenged, then what are you doing here? Everything's challenging on this channel. I guarantee you that. I'm quite challenging sometimes. Other hosts are challenging in different ways. But either way, I'll be back at 4 o'clock UK time next week. Next Saturday, it's 11 o'clock Eastern time is the start of the show. The show's called Free Association. And I think we've got music coming up very shortly, so I'm going to say goodbye. Thanks for being here, and I'll see you next week.